Everyone. I'm Bill Sutherland. It's an enormous pleasure to introduce Rob Fletcher. I'm sure you all know Rob by now. He's been here since September, as the new professor here. And I'm sure most of you went to his wonderful inaugural in the packed zoology lecture theatre. And what he's very much famous for, he's famous for lots of things, but very much for network studies, connectivity. It's delightful he's going to talk about this, and famous for studies in the US, in America on connectivity. And I think very much now you're looking for new opportunities, I think. Just so if you want to add connectivity to your connectivity person to your project, then come and chat to Rob. Is that right? And lots of other areas too. And then after the seminar, there's an early career conservationist lunch in the common room after the seminar, but those who have signed up. So that's your lesson. Next time, make sure you sign up. So Rob's going to tell us about connected Earth. Rob.
Thanks, Bill. And it's wonderful to be here today. So as Bill mentioned, I'm a new professor in the zoology department, and I had been at the University of Florida for about 17 years. But one of the reasons that I came and why I was so motivated to come here was CCI. This is a very unique place, and I do a lot of work that's at the interface of applied ecology and real conservation practice. And so what better place to be than here? So I'm really excited to be here, and I'm really excited to talk about just one aspect of my research program that Bill mentioned, which is about connectivity. And my thesis for today is that if we're going to address broad conservation goals, globally as well as locally, we need to be addressing the problem of connectivity. And I'm going to also argue that we now have the evidence. For many years we did not, but we have the evidence to support this need. And we now have the tools to actually help guide this process in a way that is useful, and the time is now. But to set the stage, what I want to do is I want to take you to a place where we do long-term research and give you a feel for what this means. So this is Kruger National Park, Southern Africa. I do long-term work in this region. And for those of you that are not familiar with this region and the park, in the 1960s, nearly the entire park was fenced for a variety of reasons. And what this did is it really constrained, even though it's an incredibly large park, it constrained some of the largest animals in terms of how they move across the landscape and their potential to persist, like savanna elephants. And Kruger National Park is part of the Greater Limpopo Transfrontier Park. So there's other parks, and there's a broader area, broader region to reconnect in this system. And so in the 1990s, there were a lot of calls to do this, and a lot of fences went down. And now we're seeing movement occurring at a much broader scale for this endangered species. And we're also seeing that the population in Kruger National Park has gone up considerably. But with this heightened movement and with this increase in population size locally, we're also seeing a lot of new conservation challenges. So this is just a news report that a colleague sent me just a few weeks ago, right when I started here, that was quite striking. 6 elephants have escaped. So it was like it was like a zoo, But 6 elephants have escaped from this park, and they're headed for this area right here, okay, just outside the park. And you can see from this map that this is a very dense population, and the concern is what's going to happen when they get there. Is there going to be conflict? Is there going to be human injury? Is there going to be elephant mortality? These are all questions about connectivity, and they're all questions that center around the interface of how organisms are moving across the planet and how they interact with people. And so we can step back more broadly and think about staggering statistics that many of you are well aware of. So across the planet, we know that landscapes are becoming more and more fragmented. About 70% of the world's remaining forest is within 1 kilometer of an edge. So what that means is that nearly all the world's forests are close to human pressures, okay, and are becoming increasingly isolated. We also know from global syntheses that animals are moving less far and less frequently. This is showing a meta-analysis of mammals across the planet, okay, showing that as the human footprint increases, animals are moving less. And we also know that when they do attempt to move across landscapes, there are strikingly high mortality rates that are happening. So in the United States, it's been estimated that up to 1 billion birds die every year from colliding with buildings, like shown in this diagram. We know that mammals, about 29 million mammals a year are killed in Europe from vehicle collisions, and about 140 million birds. So these are staggering numbers in terms of mortality that's happening as animals are trying to move across the landscape, and there's lots of failure that's arising. Okay, so this brings to the idea of, oh, maybe this is going to work. So this might be a video, and it might, it doesn't work. Okay, so what this video is going to show you is how we think about connectivity as the unimpeded flow. This is going to show a herd of elephants moving across unimpeded the Savannah and Kruger National Park. This is what we're hoping, because if we can foster this unimpeded flow, there might be lower mortality rates, greater ecosystem functioning, et cetera. But when we talk about this issue, it's really a combination of two things. The first is the landscape itself, where remaining natural areas are, where there's infrastructure, but how organisms then respond to that and their movement. So it's this interplay of movement in the landscape, which makes it a challenging issue to measure and interpret. So it has been argued in recent years, this is 3 recent books over the past 10 years, that connectivity is a real limitation in terms of limiting the persistence of species, but it's also a possible solution in terms of being able to use this idea of connectivity to foster restoration across landscapes. And so there's a lot of emphasis here from scientists and practitioners. There's also a great deal of emphasis for global conservation with the global biodiversity framework. So the third word in the first goal of the global biodiversity framework is connectivity, okay? We see this permeating this entire document. So in the first goal, it's to sustain connectivity and resilience of all ecosystems. We see this in the second target, in the third target, the famous 30 by 30 target, where it talks about here in the second target, restoration and needing to promote, restore connectivity. In the 30 by 30 target, it talks about obtaining 30% of areas, but they need to be well connected. So the question becomes, what exactly is that? And how do we measure it? How do we know when we've moved it? So the outstanding questions really in this field and for conservation, I think in this context, is what is this exactly? How can we measure it? Why does it matter, et cetera? And I think this is an outstanding question for a couple of key reasons, but in particular, this problem of connectivity applies to so many different things. So when people are talking about this, scientists and practitioners, they're kind of talking past each other sometimes, because different scientists and different practitioners are using this idea in vastly different ways. So this is just showing examples of how we can think about this problem globally in terms of migration. We can think about this term and this process more regionally in terms of protected area networks. We can think about it more at a landscape scale in terms of corridors and limiting impacts locally. And we can think about this in terms of overpasses for wildlife, sometimes referred to as wildlife bridges, that are increasingly being considered and implemented across the world. And so if we step back and say, well, what is the point of doing all this? We've put together a group of scientists and practitioners to try to really synthesize and move this field forward. And I'm going to talk about some of this work today. It's currently in revision. But when we talk about connectivity and conservation, really connectivity in and of itself is a means to an end. Really, the primary conservation goal are things that we all think about in this room: biodiversity, persistence, adaptation, ecosystem function. But the argument is that connectivity will help us get there. It'll help us get to those goals. And if we can do this, we can have several benefits emerge. So we might be able to better ensure the persistence of Earth's biodiversity and evolutionary legacy. This provides a very much a nature-based solution to resilience, and it also has the potential to promote economic and social well-being. And when scientists are trying to then, and practitioners are trying to then work in this space, I would argue that there's 4 key strategies that are relevant. The first is protection, prioritization. How do we identify the areas that are most connected, with the idea being that maybe those areas should be most prioritized? We can think about this problem and implement strategies to restore connectivity, like those wildlife bridges. Where do they need to go? How can we place them in an effective way to maximize success? We can think about this problem and implement to reduce conflict. So as animals are moving more and more across the landscape, like those elephants that escaped from the park, how do we minimize conflict? And finally, it's often brought up as a key adaptation strategy for climate change. So the idea here is that we want to ensure that species can keep track of these global changes that are happening at an ever rapid rate. And so we can think about these strategies. There's several potential benefits, et cetera. And for today, what I want to do is I want to give you sort of 2 general aspects to my program. The first, so I want to step back and be a little bit critical about this topic and say, should we really care about this? Should this really be the priority? Where is the evidence? Where's the key evidence that we need to have confidence in terms of moving forward on some of these massive plans? And then the second thing I want to talk about is how we've tried to unify the science in this field with a specific eye towards application in terms of using models and developing metrics that honor this idea, but are also hopefully quite helpful for application. And then I'll just conclude by saying, I guess what Bill said, like, please work with me. And more realistically, where I see some of these issues going and where we need to come together in many ways. Okay, so why do we care about this at all? I'm sorry about this being cut off. Looked fine on my computer. But where these ideas started was really back with MacArthur and Wilson. Many of you have probably seen a diagram like this that comes out of island biogeography, but MacArthur and Wilson were trying to understand why there's so many different species, and they vary across different islands. And they focused on 2 key issues. One is on the size of the island, how that influences extinction rates. We often think about this in terms of area-based conservation. But the other key thing was looking at how far the islands were from the mainland. This is inherently an implicit idea about isolation and whether or not species can make it to those islands. And so it wasn't long until these ideas that MacArthur put forward were repackaged for conservation. Jared Diamond did this in 1975, where he took those ideas and said, what does this mean for reserve design? What does it mean for protected areas? And how we might prioritize them. And he made this kind of diagram, what's better and what's worse. Okay? All of these issues received a lot of subsequent research, debate, and scrutiny, but it's worth pointing out that 3 of these recommendations were all about reducing the impact of isolation and promoting connectivity. So there were ideas like, yes, this seems intuitive. It seems like this should be relevant. And then it really hit the forefront with metapopulation ecology, largely Ilka Hansky's work in the 1980s and 90s, where he really very elegantly sort of crosswalked empirical data on imperiled species and models to assess. And this is just showing an example with one metric that comes out of some of his work as of what we think the risk of extinction is. So a smaller value of this metric would mean that there's a much greater extinction risk. And this is just showing a gradient of habitat loss. So the difference in these two lines are basically telling us about the role of connectivity and how contiguous the areas are and what that means for metapopulation persistence. So these ideas have been out there and they're somewhat intuitive and they had a lot of momentum. But the question becomes is, well, should we really focus on this? How much evidence is out there? And I think when we talk about the evidence, I think that we want to look at evidence not just do animals move across landscapes or do plants, can they disperse? But rather, how important are those processes to extinction risk? How important are those processes to ecosystem services? How important are those processes to biodiversity and its maintenance in space and time? Those are the critical questions. And unfortunately, we have very little empirical data that really gives us a lot of guidance at that level of these broader conservation goals. And so we've worked a lot trying to fill in those gaps. And in particular, I should say one of the key reasons why we might want to do so is there are incredible investments going on all throughout the world. So I said I come from Florida. I was at the University of Florida. Right now, there's been over 1.5 billion invested in the vision of this wildlife corridor that's going to connect natural areas throughout the state. There are overpasses like this one in Singapore being created throughout the world as well. Some of them cost anywhere from $2 to $10 million. There's one in California that's being put up in Los Angeles, basically, and it's going to cost over $100 million. And the question is that really going to improve persistence? Is that really going to have these very broad goals that we might expect from these kinds of endeavors? And so I'm going to give you just really quickly 2 examples of long-term research that we've done in my group that tries to actually address whether or not connectivity is going to be helpful for species persistence. So we do long-term work on an endangered bird in the Greater Everglades ecosystem, as well as from a restoration perspective, asking the question, if we create corridors, how much of a benefit does that have to biodiversity over the long term? So let's start real quickly with this. Wow, the colors are different too. Oh my goodness. So in any case, that was supposed to be a black and white picture. All right. Well,
I can work with you on that, Rob.
it's fine. But this is so we do have long-term work on this endangered species. It's been on the endangered species list since the 1960s in the United States, since the inception of the Endangered Species Act. And so there's been a lot of interest in this species trying to prevent its extinction, but it's also of great interest because it's thought to be the key vertebrate as an indicator for the restoration of the Everglades, which is the largest restoration in the world. And the reason for that is it specializes on these wetland systems. It moves throughout this entire system, but it's confined to it. So it's one of the only vertebrates that's using the whole system, but it's fully required for it. And so actually in Florida, this is called the Everglade snailkite because it's so restricted in this system. And so we do a lot of work on this bird. This work has been going on in a consistent way since the 1990s. Research dates back to the 1960s. We do all sorts of different kinds of data collection across this entire range where it remains. I'm not going to talk about these details, but I just want to talk about 2 key points. The first is that this population has fluctuated incredibly over time. And so there's been a period between around 1999 and 2008 where the population went from 3,000 birds down to about 700. And at that time, there was real concern that this species was about to go extinct. And there was a lot of, it was very heated. I could talk about it for a while. But since that time, we've seen increases and now we're starting to see declines again. So this gives us a means to ask, how important is connectivity to these very incredible changes that we've seen over the past 25 years? And what we found is that there's a very strong role of connectivity over time. So if we look at the overall metapopulation growth rate across this period, about 30% of that growth rate can be attributed to connectivity per se. not survival, not reproduction, but simply connectivity. And if we look at the site or local scale, in some of these sites, on average, again, even certain years it's much more, but on average, be up to 60% of the dynamics that are occurring in these local sites. And so not only are we seeing an outsized contribution, but where we see the contribution being the greatest is when the population was at its smallest size. Okay, so when the population was at greatest risk of extinction, that's when it mattered the most. Okay, and so this was very unique data to show just how important and sort of how connectivity can contribute to the growth rate of an endangered species. Okay, but what about biodiversity? So that's just one species. Oftentimes we want to do conservation in a much, much broader context. So we can ask about biodiversity more broadly. And we've done work in this space in what is the longest running and largest experiment on habitat corridors that's been attempted on the planet. And I want to give some context because this is a really cool system. I used to talk about this system and teach about it. And I would always teach that this was my favorite large experiment that had ever been done. And then I finally convinced the scientists to let me work with them. And it's been a real joy. But in any case, the context here is that historically across this entire range in the southeastern United States, this was longleaf pine savanna. And it's been nearly entirely converted. There's only 3% left. So there's huge efforts to try to restore this endangered ecosystem. This is what it looks like. It's largely, essentially a grassland of wiregrass with a few pine trees. And so in 2001, my colleagues convinced the Forest Service to restore pine plantations to savanna habitat, but they did so in a really clever experimental design. And this is showing one block in that design. I just want to explain it for a moment. And it's really great. You can see this on Google Earth. And there's been phone calls to the federal government saying that there's aliens that are causing strange aberrations in the environment. But the idea here is that you have this center patch and it's connected to another patch via a corridor. And then you have a treatment that's an unconnected patch that's rectangular in shape, and it's the same area as this patch and the corridor. So it controls for habitat area to isolate that effect. And then you have these two wing patches in this block that are effectively corridors to nowhere. And I'm not going to talk much about these, but this gives us a richer understanding in terms of why corridors may or may not work. And so about 10 years ago, I started working with this group, and I was really interested in asking the question about extinction and colonization dynamics, because they've been collecting data on plant diversity each year in terms of understory plants in these newly created savannas. And so we're continuing this work today, but I want to talk about some published results. And what we find is that when you add a corridor, plant diversity increased by about 14%. But not only did it increase by 14%, we were seeing these clear benefits for at least 18 years. So they weren't short-term benefits. They're very much long-term benefits. I've recently reanalyzed data going out to 23 years now, and the same pattern is still there. Okay, so not only is it saying that corridors improve biodiversity in this savanna ecosystem, but these effects are long-term and they're maintained. And we can ask, well, why is this happening? And most of the benefits are occurring from colonization being increased, and to a lesser extent, lower local extinction rates. And these are annual rates, so they get compounded over time, where each year you're getting more colonization, more colonization, more colonization if you have a habitat corridor. So this was really, really exciting work to show experimentally the benefits of corridors for biodiversity. But in most situations, we aren't going to have these long-term data, right? We're not going to, we can't do these intensive studies. And what we need to know is, what do we do in terms of application? Okay. How do we provide guidance for conservation, and how do we hopefully promote connectivity in a way that helps reach some of these broader conservation goals. And so we've been trying to sort of fill this gap, if you will, by creating hopefully unified models that can be applied to address a lot of different conservation problems in this context. I want to spend a little bit of time now. Yes, okay. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about this. Okay, so the idea here is that when we start thinking about this problem of connectivity, it's a spatially explicit problem, right? We're talking about landscapes and whether or not they're connected. And in this way, movement and dispersal biology are rarely incorporated into these efforts. And in the context of this field, we often talk about structural connectivity, which is shown here, which is really talking about how connected forest cover is, or grasslands, or intact areas. Okay? But what we ideally want to know about is functional connectivity. That is to say, how are organisms responding to these changes in the landscape, and what does it then mean for their ability to persist and grow? And so in this way, we can go back to the global biodiversity framework. This is a slide that was shared by Gary Tabor, who's the IUCN chair for the Connectivity Conservation Specialist Group.
It's okay. It's just a chime. Don't worry about it.
Yeah, I just don't.
It's fine.
It's fine.
Don't worry about it.
But this is just showing the current metrics that are being proposed for the global biodiversity framework. And these metrics are really useful in many respects, and we can use them across broad scales. But it's important to realize that all of these metrics here are essentially getting at that structural aspect of the landscape when we talk about monitoring, conservation, and connectivity. This is just showing an example. This was an article that was really helpful looking at how connected are protected areas across the world. And the title tells, like, you can read the title, you don't need to read the rest of the paper. So just 10% of the global terrestrial protected area network is structurally connected. And this was a staggering statistic when we start thinking about that 30 by 30 target and that idea of having a well-connected set of protected areas. And so it's important to realize, though, that while this was really helpful work, it's really just measuring the contiguity of intact land. We don't know how species are responding to this. We don't know whether or not this is limiting ecosystem function or limiting the persistence of species in these landscapes. Okay? And so when we try to unpack these issues, it's worth thinking for just a moment about, about dispersal biology and movement biology that's kind of fundamental to this problem. And so we can think about two key things. The first is what happens when organisms disperse, plants and animals alike. And we can often break this down into three key parts. One is sort of, do you stay or do you go? That immigration part. Is there movement at the beginning? The second is how does movement happen across these potentially inhospitable landscapes? This is sometimes referred to as the transient phase, and then whether or not you actually even make it to another protected area. Okay? And so in each of these issues, we can think about key factors that are important. How big is the population here? How many barriers are here? Is there potential for conflict? And what is available here once an organism gets there? Are there places to potentially recruit? So this is helpful in terms of just generally, hopefully thinking a bit about the biology. The other key thing that is important is this idea that species, when they move very frequently at close distances and very rarely at far distances. Okay, and so there's an element of geographic isolation. And there's an element that some species move farther than others. And this is often represented as a dispersal kernel, which is just a statistical summary of that spatial pattern. Okay. And so ultimately, each of these issues we know are fundamental to movement biology. And I could talk for much longer about other nuances, but these are like fundamental basics of movement biology. And none of the metrics I mentioned before are really capturing any of this. Okay. And we know that landscapes are complex. We know that it's not just how far apart are landscapes, but will there be survival? Will a species be able to make it to suitable habitat? And so we've been trying to address this problem in a variety of ways. So we've sort of set up a multi-level framework for thinking about this problem, where if you're a practitioner or if you're trying to develop indicators for monitoring connectivity, we know we can measure structural connectivity through remote sensing products. That's already being done, and that's certainly helpful. Okay. But as we kind of try to make it towards these ultimate goals, the next most important thing is understanding the biology of species or processes and the scale at which they're moving through these kernels, dispersal kernels. And if we want to go further, and for certain problems we need to understand how resistant is that landscape. Are there threats? Are there human land uses? Is there the potential for conflict? And once we get all the way down there, down through these top three sort of levels, we can better link this kind of information to species persistence, ecological function, et cetera. So how do we do that? Well, we're trying to work in this way, and we've been working quite a bit on developing frameworks and workflows for going through this process. And oh my. Okay. So there's going to be something else. Really interesting. It's okay. Okay. So basically, I can make lots of jokes here, but what we've tried to do is think about this working from the ground up. And we've developed what we refer to as kind of this unifying framework that's based on Markov chains. And we unfortunately call it this spatial absorbing Markov chain based on the math. We should have called it something really cool like connect landscapes or something like that. But that's sort of the mathematical framework we're using. And I'll just skip this for now and jump right into there it is. Okay, so what you have is you've got, oftentimes we're working with maps like this, and I think the next part is not going to happen. But in general, we can think about like, how do we view this problem of movement in a mapping context? And we can convert this type of raster-based summary into a network and do lots of interesting math, which you don't get to see. But why Markov chains? I'm not going to talk about the details, but I want to sort of give a simple reason for why. The reason why Markov is relevant is because it refers to random walks. And nearly all of movement ecology conceptually is built on random walks. So we can crosswalk with actual movement biology in a very straightforward way. The reason why absorption matters is absorption tells us about the stopping of movement. This could be because movement was successful, or it could be because it failed. And it can fail for lots of different reasons through death, poaching, conflict, et cetera. And so this allows us a way to kind of honor movement biology in a simple way, but also better interpret when success happens versus failure. And so this sort of framework, we think, unifies most of the connectivity models that are out there. So for example, it honors dispersal kernels. They naturally emerge in this framework. So it's relevant to movement biology and mortality risk. It's also directly related to movement data that we might collect in the field. Okay, like the data that we collected for the snail kite. We can directly crosswalk measurements in the field to how this model works. And a wide range of empirical movement data. It's formally related to a lot of theory and estimation and population genetics, which is relevant because a lot of the long-term questions with connectivity are evaluated through genetics approaches. And so it allows us to work with that kind of information too. And we've also shown that these models, that other models that people use, this is showing a diagram using circuit theory, which is increasingly used in this field. These are all special cases. So we can kind of sort of look at the entire landscape, if you will, of these kinds of metrics and capture nearly all of them with this framework. It's also very relevant to conservation strategies, and this is why we were motivated to look at this problem. So just real quickly, we can fully capture metapopulation and demography of species in an extinction risk context. And we can do this in a much more computationally efficient way. So we can capture metrics like metapopulation capacity that I mentioned previously, that Ilka Hansky developed years ago. We can also map the flow and identify the potential for restoration possibilities where restoration is most needed between protected areas. We can focus on conflict. So this is showing an example with gray wolves. I'll talk a bit more about this in a bit, but it allows us a means to look at human-wildlife conflict. And it is also a dynamic model at its core. So we can start thinking about change and can we keep up can species keep up with climate change? So we think this is a very generalizable model, and we've been applying it in a lot of different situations. This is just some of the examples that we've recently applied it to or in the process of applying it to. So for example, we've applied this framework to help the Forest Service guide where they're reintroducing gray wolves in Colorado. Believe it or not, people voted to release gray wolves in Colorado. And as soon as they passed that act, there was immediate concern about where are we going to do this and how can we do this in a way that limits conflict and while also making restoration or reintroduction successful. In the Everglades, we're flipping the problem and we're saying, how do we best get rid of Burmese pythons? How can we do, they're actively doing removal programs because this is an incredible, if you haven't heard about the Burmese python in the Everglades, it's been a complete nightmare where nearly all the mammals have been extirpated in the Everglades because of this species over the past 15 years. And so the Park Service is trying to actively remove them. And the question is, how do we do this efficiently? We've been doing that. Right now, we're working with BirdLife International to try to better interpret restoration opportunities for the important bird areas network. And then we've also applied this in a couple of contexts to human-wildlife conflict. And I just want to give you a real quick example of that with work that we've done on the Asian elephant. And so human-elephant conflict is a major problem both in Southeast Asia as well as in many places in Africa, because elephants, they don't do what we want them to do sometimes, and they often move out of protected areas, they raid crops, they come into contact with people, and oftentimes either the elephant dies or there can be human injury and even human mortality. So it's a big issue in many areas. Former PhD student who now runs a conservation NGO in India, we partnered and did a bunch of surveys outside of these protected areas in the Western Ghats in Southwest India. And so what we were trying to identify is where local communities were seeing elephants and where conflict occurred. And we used this information to parameterize the model. And then we used independent media reports of when conflict was in the news and what happened, where it happened, et cetera. To ask the question like, yes, we can build these models, but are they actually telling us something that's predictive and effective? And so we were able to validate the model against crop damage, elephant mortality, as well as human injury, and ask whether or not we can anticipate these kinds of problems. So there's a lot to this work. I'm just going to show you a couple of results. This is showing the model and how it's predicting movement and where potential corridors occur. You can see it really lights up down here because this is where the largest population of elephants currently are. So we think, so the model is predicting that that's where the greatest amount of movement is going to occur out of the protected areas in the Southwest. But more importantly, we're able to predict where we expect high conflict to occur. Okay. And this is showing one map of that. We predicted it over the long term as well as over shorter time intervals. And ultimately, these models were performing well. So models have better performance than other types of models that are commonly used in this context because they're capturing this complexity of movement. And they were ultimately much better at predicting elephant mortality and then human injury and then crop damage. And in hindsight, this makes sense. I'm happy to talk about it more for those that are interested. And so ultimately where this work was going is now Divya's her NGO conservation initiatives are working with local communities to try to basically do more strategic conservation in this area. And the argument here is that in this map here, we can see orange areas, which are high movement, areas of predicted high movement, but low conflict. And in these areas, these are essentially what we refer to as secure corridors. We want to maintain that movement and kind of keep the status quo. But the important areas for changes in management are where connectivity is high and conflict is high, as well as where movement's expected to be low, but there's still conflict. And so what she's doing is she's working with local communities in this type of area to have them start reconsidering putting up barriers and fences because they might be effective, and ultimately these areas are not important for connectivity for elephants. But over here, this is the most complex area where we want to ideally maintain the ability for elephants to move across the landscape, but we need to reduce conflict. So she's doing a lot of stakeholder meetings and engagement to figure out strategies to deal with these sorts of issues. Okay, so I'm just going to end by saying a few things. I think this example with Asian elephants really speaks a lot to the complexity of this problem, where we're trying to promote movement, we're trying to promote persistence of species, but this is needed in increasingly dominated areas where humans and wildlife collide. And so I want to just end by giving you 3 quick take-home points and some thoughts about future work. So take home number 1. We often think about habitat. We often think about area, the 30 by 30 target. I think our work suggests that habitat alone is not sufficient, and we need to put connectivity in the forefront in terms of reducing risks of extinction for endangered species. Second, restoring connectivity, building corridors can have long-term benefits, and they can be potentially quite useful for biodiversity. There's often, historically, there's been sort of this counter argument that, well, if we promote corridors, maybe that's going to cause invasive species to move, and that could be a real cost, and maybe we shouldn't do it for those reasons. As of today, there's no strong evidence that that is a key issue. It's been looked at over and over again, very little evidence. What we tend to see benefits for native species. And then finally, we think that isolating how landscapes influence both successes and failures and why failures occur. Is it because of conflict? Is it because of poaching? Is it because of these other outstanding issues? That by addressing these sorts of problems, it'll improve conservation applications. Okay, so 3 quick things and I'm done, I promise. Okay, so I want to talk real quickly about where I see this work going, and hopefully some of these topics will be of interest to folks in this room. So the first is, I started with this question: well, what's well connected? How do we measure it? How do we know when we get there? This is still an outstanding question. In the article that I mentioned that our group has recently written, we take a stab at defining this issue. And the argument that we make is that a landscape is well connected if movement is sufficient to maintain these broader goals: persistence, function, ecosystem services, okay? And that if we can monitor that relative to a counterfactual that makes predictions based on what if connectivity was broken, we can actually know when a landscape is or is not well connected, and we can monitor that. And so we're trying to build workflows that are parsimonious, that honor the biology just enough to make it relevant to species, but that we can do this for lots of species across broad areas. And I think there's a lot of potential in this space, and that's some of the work that we're doing with BirdLife right now. And there's potential in terms of making this scalable, but also in terms of making metrics easy and relatable, but also relevant for this problem of extinction risk. I have several ideas on that, and I think hopefully there's people in this room that are interested in these kinds of problems as well. The second key issue is that we need to do more thinking about how do we promote connectivity and coexistence with nature. Because more and more, this is where these two main issues are intersecting. And there's examples of this working really well. This is an example of the Kata corridor in Nepal that's managed sustainably by a local community committee. In Florida, with the Florida Wildlife Corridor, what we know is there's huge opportunity areas in these ranch lands, which appear to be quite good for connectivity, but they're under extreme pressure for urban development. And the local communities don't want that, right? So they want to preserve their cultural heritage. And so there's this potential for a win-win in terms of conserving connectivity, but also promoting local livelihoods. And I think to do this, what we need is we need to build interdisciplinary teams. So a lot of interdisciplinary teams. So a lot of the work I've talked about so far today is getting the evidence and having tools that are helpful. But we need to go beyond that, and we need to connect scientists and computer scientists and engineers with social scientists, planners, and practitioners, so they're working together and ideally in harmony in terms of what science we need and how we can apply it in an effective way. And I think there's a lot of potential here to continue to build these sorts of collaborations. So with that, I just want to, yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Excellent. Questions?
I was super happy to see like your incorporation of the social dimensions towards the end. But I was wondering, why not, shift the definition of what well-connected means to actually really fully embrace that? Because well already has all these normative dimensions to it. So, I mean, have you thought about bringing that into the definition of well-connected? That it shouldn't be like a story where there's going to be a lot of conflict, that it should be, procedurally equitable in how it's developed and things like that.
That's a really good point. And we struggled a lot with that definition, and we need to resubmit the manuscript. This is very good fodder. But, we tried to very loosely capture that with the idea of ecosystem services, but that's not really doing it justice.
Why?
Yeah.
So that's
Yeah,
just an output.
Yeah, for sure. But yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Yes.
Thank you. Mine's more about the corridors, I guess, in particular Florida. So I guess big picture thinking, obviously, we just had a Hurricane Milton kind of come through this area. And so my bigger question is, as people are trying to form these corridors, really put this into place, I guess one question is what have those impacted these potential corridors, since you're trying to spend billions of pounds or dollars on constructing them? And kind of, I guess, moreover that, as we're seeing these events increase, is there any kind of policy work or what kind of measures are being put in place to safeguard funds that you're putting?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so the question for those that didn't hear it was, in the Florida Wildlife Corridor, it's an interesting but very salient problem in terms of hurricanes and climate change are changing that landscape, and how much does that impede it? How do we safeguard our investments for conservation and connectivity? Is that loosely right? Okay. So what I would say about that is a really important question. And it's something that honestly, one of the many reasons why there's been such a push for this system is they're trying to think about solutions to deal with, in particular, their sea level rise. In the Everglades, and there's a lot going into the restoration of the Everglades, but the Everglades is going to be underwater in a century. Right. And so the question is, how can organisms keep up with that change? And the thinking is having a corridor system will help. In terms of the hurricanes have had big impacts, but I think from a connectivity perspective, where I would be most concerned with the impacts is whether or not those changes result in development in new areas and how that may reduce connectivity. I think the impacts on the natural systems there it's a natural disturbance and it's not going to affect.
So Brent from WCMC, Brent Wilson, has there been any research exploring the relationship between connectivity and zoonotic disease spread, both between wild populations as well as spillover to human populations? Is there a known relationship between these factors?
Oh, that's a great question and a complicated one. So it was about disease spread and connectivity. And I think I'm not a disease biologist, so I'll preface everything I say with that statement, but there's a lot of interest in that work. And my understanding of it is it's complicated. At one level, you would expect connectivity to increase that potential spread. But because so much of spread of zoonotic diseases in terms of human effects come from other mechanisms that aren't about habitat, aren't about sort of how connected the environment is, it's a lot of those models that just focus on the environment are not very predictive of the outcomes. But it's a very important issue.
Given the importance of connectivity and the role that connectivity plays in, say, local population size, abundance densities, can you use your models to make some prediction, which is essentially like, given the current status of the habitat patches, if we solve connectivity problem, what kind of gain, what kind of boost would we get to wildlife populations simply by solving the connectivity issue and doing nothing to restore the existing habitats? I wonder if that like how big would that jump be?
Yeah, I think the devil's in the details, so to speak, but it's certainly possible to do those kinds of scenarios you can do it with our modeling framework and also potentially some other models. Yeah.
Have a sense of how big it would be?
I think it's going to depend a lot on the current context, honestly. So, where that population is and how much habitat you're starting with. When it's low, the gains are going to be high. And when there's more habitat or a larger population, the gains are going to be less. The question is how much less, right?
Yeah. You talked about how those more threatened species, so most on the brink, are going to benefit most from connectivity, or it has like the biggest influence on their status. What about sort of more widespread species? Because obviously the examples you give about things like roadkill, these birds flying into things, they're common species or abundant species that are sort of getting killed at this scale. So you found evidence actually it's sort of maybe bimodal, where it's at both extremes have a bad effect, or the sort of loss in biomass we're seeing generally is driven by loss of connectivity.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, I'll start with the system I showed you. And in that system, we were actually very surprised just how important it was, because honestly, that species can move across its entire range in a couple of days. We know that from tracking data. Now, in practice, it doesn't, though. It doesn't very frequently, and where it reproduces is much more constrained. And so even for species that have the potential to move across broad areas, I don't think we should be assuming in conservation that then connectivity is a non-issue, right? It can still have very big impacts. In terms of more common species, and I think that, the example with birds colliding with buildings, those numbers are staggering, and it is often more common species, but there's also national assessments that show that even the common species in some of these groups are declining quite a bit over time, over the past 30 years. And the question is how much of it is from issues like that, right? And I don't think we have that answer. Yeah.
Really interesting. One quick thing, actually. Have you looked at how the improvements in connectivity are matched by changes in population genetics, and sort of trying to bring the kind of whole population genetics element into this?
So we've looked at population genetics in this context as well. And I think it, and there's a lot of work on population genetics and connectivity. And we know it's really important. I think there's a danger, and I think the field has sort of kind of blended ecological time with evolutionary time. And sometimes it's been confusing, right? So, because if we think about connectivity for population genetics, we really need very little movement, right? Just a little bit, it might be sufficient. But if we're thinking about population trends and numbers, we need a lot more movement. And so, yes, it's fully important, but I think we have to be careful with how we mix those sort of types of information because they're operating on different timescales.
Final question.
You may have done a lot of work in Singapore, urban habitats. My question is, with regard to urban habitats and ensuring connectivity within cities and stuff, do buildings really help? Buildings with green roofs and, green areas and stuff like that. Do you think that provides, buildings becoming green buildings will actually provide enough of a medium for connectivity within the urban habitats, given that anyway, biodiversity is low in these habitats?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, and I'd like to step back a little bit. So in urban areas, we think about buildings and infrastructure, and we think about things like those overpasses and crossings. And it's important to realize, like, even when those passes are really expensive, right? And yes, we know that animals move them. We don't really know how much that changes their persistence likelihood, but there's another benefit that's independent of that, and that's the costs to insurance and things like that. When you hit a deer or you hit some sort of animal, there's an economic cost. And that's honestly what's driving those investments more than anything else. Now, with birds hitting buildings, there's less of an economic investment for why we would want to try to have green buildings from that perspective, right? We do know that some of those strategies really do reduce mortality rates. There's some good data on that, and it depends exactly how it's done, but there is that potential.